Hampton Court Palace, 1535. You are standing outside the most powerful bedroom in England, and the first thing you notice, before you see anything, before you hear anything, is the smell. It is not the smell of royalty. It is not perfume or beeswax candles or fresh linen. It is the smell of a man who has not bathed in weeks, living in a room where the walls themselves have absorbed years of unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, and something darker underneath all of it. Something biological. Something is wrong. And that smell? It has already killed 3 of the men who worked in this room. Not from disease, from politics, from getting too close to the most dangerous body in England. This is the bedroom of Henry VIII, and by the end of this video, you will understand why walking into this room was more dangerous than walking onto any battlefield in Europe. There is one person in this bedroom who knows every secret Henry VIII has ever had, every physical weakness, every private fear, every moment the king has been vulnerable, and that person is not his wife, not his minister, not his priest. We will get to who it is, and there is a specific smell in this room, one particular source that physicians in 1535 believed was literally poisoning the air, a smell that they thought was killing people. They were wrong about the cause, but they were completely right that it was killing people. That story is coming. First, let us walk inside. The king's bedchamber is not one room. It is a series of rooms, each one more private than the last, designed as a physical map of power. The outermost room is the Great Chamber. Anyone with a court invitation can enter here. Hundreds of people pass through daily. It is loud, crowded, and smells like a market. Past the Great Chamber is the Presence Chamber. This is where the king receives important visitors, ambassadors, senior ministers, men whose business is urgent enough to warrant a private audience. Entry here requires an invitation. Past the Presence Chamber is the Privy Chamber. Only the most trusted courtiers enter this room. The men who sleep outside this door at night. The men who dress and undress the king here. The men who manage the daily operations of the royal body. They are selected personally by Henry. Entry into the Privy Chamber is one of the most jealously guarded privileges at the Tudor court. And past the Privy Chamber, past 2 more locked doors, is the bedchamber itself. Very few people in England have ever stood where you are standing right now. The bed alone tells you everything. It is enormous, 7 feet wide, 6 feet long, layered with mattresses, straw at the bottom, wool above it, feathers on top, and covered with curtains that can be completely closed, sealing the king inside his own private darkness. The bed frame is carved oak, the curtains are embroidered silk, and every single piece of it, the mattresses, the sheets, the curtains, is changed and cleaned on a schedule so strict that it is written into the palace's official regulations. Not because Henry cared about cleanliness, because Henry was terrified of assassination. Every piece of fabric that touched the royal body was inspected before it came near him. Every person who entered this room was searched. Every item of food that crossed the threshold was tasted by someone else first. The rules governing this room were not about comfort. They were about survival. Because Henry VIII, in 1535, had already destroyed enough people that he understood better than anyone exactly how many enemies he had made. The most powerful smell in the king's bedroom in 1535 did not come from the unwashed sheets. It did not come from the chamber pots. It did not come from the dozens of candles burning in a room with limited ventilation. It came from Henry's leg. In 1527, Henry had sustained a jousting wound to his left leg. The wound had never fully healed. By 1535, it had developed into a chronic ulcer, an open wound that oozed constantly, required daily dressing, and produced a smell that contemporary accounts describe with the kind of careful diplomatic language that tells you the reality was considerably worse than the words suggest. The physician Thomas Vicary, one of the men who tended this wound, recorded that the ulcer needed to be packed with linen, treated with medicinal preparations, and dressed multiple times per day. What he did not record, because writing it plainly would have been dangerous, was that by some accounts, the smell from Henry's leg could be detected outside the bedchamber door before it was opened, 3 rooms away, through 2 locked doors. Now, you might expect that a king with a rotting leg wound would be treated gently, that the men around him would offer comfort and care and quiet sympathy. You would be wrong. The men around Henry in 1535 were in active daily life-or-death competition for his favor, showing the king weakness, acknowledging his physical decline, expressing pity for his condition, mentioning the smell was one of the fastest ways to destroy your career or your life. Because Henry did not respond to weakness with gratitude, he responded with rage. And rage, from Henry VIII, had a specific and documented tendency to end in executions. So the courtiers pretended, every single one of them. They stood in the king's bedchamber in 1535, with the smell of the infected leg filling the room. and they kept their faces neutral and their conversation cheerful and their bodies carefully positioned so that nothing in their expression suggested they were aware of anything unusual. The performance required to survive in this room was, in some ways, more demanding than combat. The person who knew every secret Henry VIII had ever had was not a spy, not a minister, not a confessor. It was the groom of the stool. The groom of the stool held the most intimate position in the Tudor court. His official duty was to attend the king during his most private bodily functions, to present the basin of warm water, to provide the linen, to assist, if required, with the physical act itself. He supervised the entire privy chamber. He controlled who entered the bedchamber and who was turned away. But his real power came from something else entirely. Every morning, in the few minutes before the formal lever began, before the ambassadors and ministers and courtiers assembled outside the door, the groom had the king's complete, unguarded attention. Henry in those private minutes was not performing. He was not constructing a political position. He was not managing his image for an audience. He was simply a man in a room with one other person. And whatever was said in those minutes shaped what Henry thought and felt and decided that day. In 1536, 1 year after the moment we are standing in right now, the groom of the stool was a man named Henry Norris, senior, trusted, wealthy. Henry's companion in that intimate morning space for years. Henry Norris was arrested in May 1536 on charges of adultery with Anne Boleyn. He was executed on Tower Hill 17 days after his arrest. Most historians today believe the charges were fabricated, a political purge. Anne Boleyn's faction was being dismantled, and Norris, as the most powerful man in the Privy Chamber, was the most dangerous person attached to it. The man who had spent years in the most private room in England, who had more genuine access to Henry's trust than almost any other person alive, died because that closeness made him too powerful to survive once Henry turned against him. Proximity to the king was never protection. It was exposure. The lever, Henry's formal waking, began at 8 in the morning. But what happened before the lever is the part nobody talks about. At 5 in the morning, the first servants entered the outer rooms of the Privy Chamber to prepare. Fires were laid. Water was heated. The king's clothes for the day, selected, inspected, and laid out according to a protocol so detailed it had its own written regulations, were arranged in order of dressing. The groom entered the bedchamber first. He inspected the room. He assessed the king's condition. He oversaw the changing of the wound dressing on Henry's leg, a procedure that required 2 people, clean linen, and considerable care, because an infection that worsened could shift the political calculations of the entire court within days. Henry's physical condition in 1535 was the most classified information in England, not because anyone tried to keep it secret, because everyone was too frightened to say it plainly. The court knew Henry's leg was getting worse. Foreign ambassadors knew. Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador, tracked the king's health obsessively and reported it to the Holy Roman Emperor because Henry's physical condition directly determined the likelihood of war, succession crises, and diplomatic realignments across Europe. A king who was dying had a different value as an ally than a king who was not. But nobody said it inside the palace. Not plainly. Not within hearing distance of anyone who might report it. Because suggesting that Henry VIII was physically declining was, in practical terms, suggesting that Henry VIII was mortal. And Henry VIII did not respond well to being reminded that he was mortal. Every meal Henry ate in 1535 was tasted before it reached him. The taster, an official position, a real job with a real salary, consumed a portion of each dish and then waited. If he showed no signs of illness within a reasonable period, the food was considered safe. This process protected Henry from deliberate poisoning. It did nothing to protect him from what his diet was actually doing to his body. Henry in 1535 consumed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 calories per day, almost entirely meat, game, fat, sugar, and alcohol. Vegetables were considered, on medical authority, dangerous for men of elevated constitution. Raw fruit caused fever. Green vegetables caused melancholy. Roots and leaves were suitable only for peasants whose bodies were hardened to coarse food. Henry ate almost none. The gout had already begun. Swollen joints, excruciating pain, the particular agony of uric acid crystals forming in the joints of the feet and hands. Gout was so associated with wealthy eating that it was called the disease of kings. Henry had earned it thoroughly. The sugar was destroying his teeth. His doctors prescribed sugar, in wine, in preserves, in the elaborate confections that arrived at every meal, as a medicine and a restorative. The sugar that was rotting his teeth was being administered as a health treatment, and every cup he drank from, every goblet, every wine vessel was pewter. Old pewter. Pewter that contained up to 40% lead alloy. Every acidic wine, every spiced drink, every hot liquid that passed through those vessels was leaching lead directly into Henry's body. Every single day, with no one understanding what was happening, and no one who could have stopped it even if they had. The king who terrorized an entire court. The king who executed ministers and wives and friends the moment they became inconvenient. The king whose leg wound filled the room with a smell that nobody was permitted to acknowledge. He was being slowly poisoned by his own dinner. And the people who served that dinner to him, the tasters, the servers, the groom who dressed his wound every morning, none of them could tell him. Not because they did not care, because telling him was more dangerous than watching it happen. At night, 2 gentlemen of the privy chamber slept outside the bedchamber door. Not in comfortable quarters, outside the door, on pallets, in the corridor. Their job was to be available if the king called in the night, to be the first line of response if something happened. Inside the bedchamber, with the curtains drawn around the great bed, Henry slept, or tried to. The leg ulcer made sleep difficult. Contemporary accounts describe Henry in his later years as irritable, unpredictable, and prone to sudden rages that courtiers learned to navigate by watching his expression in the moments before he spoke. The correlation between Henry's worsening physical condition and his worsening political violence, the acceleration of executions, the escalating paranoia, the increasingly erratic decisions, is visible in the historical record across the years from 1535 onward. The men sleeping outside his door in 1535 were not just guards. They were sentinels watching a man whose pain was shaping the fate of England, and they could say nothing because the rules of the bedchamber, the same rules that gave them power, that made their position valuable, that placed them at the center of the most important political space in the kingdom, also required them to perform contentment and loyalty and ease every single moment they were in that space. Henry VIII died in January 1547. He was 55 years old. He had outlived 2 of his 6 wives, executed them. He had outlived 2 of his chief ministers, Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, executed them both. He had outlived Cardinal Wolsey, who died on the road to his own arrest. He had also outlived the men who served in his bedchamber. Henry Norris, executed 1536. Thomas Culpeper, executed 1541 on charges of adultery with Catherine Howard. The list is longer than most histories of the period bother to record. The men who stood closest to Henry VIII in that private, intimate space, who knew his secrets, dressed his wound, managed his body, and performed the daily domestic rituals of the most powerful bedroom in England, were among the most politically vulnerable people in the kingdom, not despite their closeness. Because of it. The smell in that room in 1535, the wound, the unwashed bodies, the centuries of absorbed history in the walls, was not the deadliest thing in it. The deadliest thing was knowing too much about a man who could not afford to be known. Drop a comment right now. If you had been offered a position in Henry's privy chamber in 1535, knowing what you now know, would you have taken it? And tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single one.